The rain hit the window of that Vegas hotel room like static on an old radio, and it was almost 3 a.m. when Dean stood there without moving, his hand locked around the edge of a table, his eyes red from something that wasn't liquor this time. On the phone was a voice shaking, an old woman crying, saying words that would never leave his memory. "My son, some men hurt me," and they dragged Sammy by his collar in front of everyone. In that single moment, nobody could have guessed that this night was about to become one of the most violent and quietly legendary stories ever whispered behind the velvet curtains of Las Vegas. A story passed in hushed tones between waiters and lounge musicians for years afterward. A story that changed shape every time it was told, but whose core always stayed the same. A simple man named Dean, an Italian-American singer working the casino circuit, decided to stand against someone nobody else dared to face. And by the time the sun came up over the desert that morning, the city would understand exactly what that decision cost and exactly what it was worth. To understand how it got to that phone call at 3 a.m, you have to go back further, back to the years before any of it, back to two young men who met not as legends but as nobodies, two hungry performers scraping together whatever work they could find in the smaller lounges that lined the edges of the Strip, back when their names still meant nothing to anyone outside the rooms they played in. Dean was the crooner with the easy smile who could calm any rowdy crowd with a single held note, the kind of man who never seemed to be trying too hard, even when he was trying harder than anyone in the room. Sammy was something else entirely, a whirlwind of talent, a boy who sang and danced and told jokes with a kind of desperate, dazzling energy, as if he knew that a single misbeat, a single moment of hesitation, could cost him everything the world was so reluctant to give him in the first place. They met backstage one night when a booking agent tried to shortchange them both on the same evening, and instead of fighting each other for the bigger cut, they turned on the agent together, laughing about it afterward over cheap coffee in an all-night diner until sunrise. From that night on, something between them locked into place, something that would prove, years later, far stronger than either of them understood at the time. By the time this story takes place, both men had climbed further up a ladder of that strange, glittering city. Dean was headlining rooms of his own, his voice smooth as glass, and Sammy was pulling in crowds that stretched around the block, his name finally starting to mean something on the marquees. But fame in Vegas back then didn't come with clean hands. Every casino, every lounge, every hotel with a stage were performing on answered, in one way or another, to men who never appeared in any of the photographs. Men who moved through back hallways and private offices, while the tourists up front saw only lights and music and smiling faces. It was an unspoken rule that every performer learned quickly or paid for slowly. You could sing whatever you wanted on stage, but off stage, you smiled at the right men and you never, ever said no to them twice. Sammy's mother, Rosa, had no interest in any of that world. She lived far enough from the Strip that the neon barely reached her street, in a small apartment with a kitchen window that looked out over a row of dusty palm trees, and she filled her days the way most proud mothers do, cooking too much food for one person, trading gossip with her neighbors on the front step in the evenings, and maintaining, with an almost religious devotion, a thick leather photo album filled with every newspaper clipping that ever mentioned her son's name. She would run her fingers over the printer's name in the entertainment pages, like she was reading scripture, and she'd tell anyone who'd listen, in that soft, accented voice of hers, "That's my son, you understand?" People drive across the desert just to hear that boy sing. She never asked Sammy for money, never asked for a bigger apartment or a car or any of the things his growing success could easily have bought her. All she ever wanted was for him to visit on Sundays and for him to eat something more than coffee and cigarettes before a show. Into this fragile, ordinary happiness stepped a man named Vito, a name that, in certain rooms of that city, was never spoken above a whisper. They called him the Fox, and the nickname wasn't for his cunning alone. It was for the way he could vanish after doing something cruel, slipping back into respectability so cleanly that by morning it was as if the cruelty had never happened at all, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. Vito ran a stretch of smaller clubs and backroom casinos on the edges of the Strip, places where the real money moved in cash and favors rather than chips, and he had built his entire identity, his entire sense of self, around one unbreakable rule. Nobody told Vito no. Waiters who were slow with his drinks vanished from their jobs overnight. A car dealer who once questioned a payout found his car firebombed in an alley 2 nights later, and nobody, not even police who found it, asked too many questions about who might have done it. Fear was Vito's currency, and he spent it liberally, and he had never, not once in all his years running that stretch of the city, met a person who refused to pay it. Until Sammy. It happened on an unremarkable Tuesday evening. Vito had sent one of his men backstage after a show with a simple, almost friendly request. He wanted Sammy performed free of charge at a private party he was throwing at his own club the following weekend, a kind of unofficial toll for privilege of working comfortably in a city that Vito considered, in every way that mattered, his own. Sammy, still catching his breath from the show, sweat cooling on his collar, listened to the request with a polite, tired smile, and said exactly what any working performer with a full calendar might reasonably say. Tell him I appreciate the invitation, but I've got other commitments that weekend. My managers already booked me solid. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't an insult. It was simply the truth, delivered without malice, the kind of answer any manager anywhere would have given on behalf of a client with a packed schedule. But when Vito heard the answer relayed back to him, sitting in the private booth of his own club with 3 of his men around him, something in his face went very still and very quiet. And that stillness was far more dangerous than any outburst could have been. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply smiled, a slow, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes, and said softly, "No problem. Tell him I understand." His men exchanged uneasy glances at that smile, because they had learned through hard experience that Vito's calm was never actually calm. It was the sound of a door quietly closing on a decision already made. He did not forgive a refusal. He filed it away, patient as a spider, and began to wait for the moment when the wound would land somewhere it could never be brushed aside. 2 weeks passed in ordinary rhythm. Sammy performed, rehearsed, laughed with Dean over late suppers after their shows, and thought nothing more of the small, uncomfortable exchange with Vito's man. He had no way of knowing that somewhere in the city, quiet men were watching his mother's small apartment, learning her routines, learning the hours she liked to walk to the corner market for vegetables, learning that she carried her photo album with her sometimes to show to friends, learning every soft, unguarded detail of an old woman's simple, trusting life. The attack came on a cold evening with a wind that rattled the palm fronds outside Rosa's window. She had walked the 3 blocks to the market exactly as she always did, her coat buttoned against the chill, the photo album tucked under her arm, because she'd promised to show a neighbor a new clipping about Sammy's latest show. Halfway there, a black sedan eased up along the curb beside her, its engine barely above a whisper, and before she understood what was happening, 2 large men had stepped out onto the sidewalk. One seized her arm in a grip that would leave bruises for weeks, leaning close enough that she could smell the cigarette smoke on his breath, and hissed, "Tell your son to learn some respect." The other man snatched the album from beneath her arm, and as she cried out, reaching helplessly for it, he threw it to the pavement and ground his heel into the spine of it, twisting his foot until the old leather cracked and the photographs inside tore and smeared across the wet concrete. She tried to scream, and a rough hand clamped over her mouth, and a voice close to her ear warned, "Don't make a scene, old woman, or next time it's worse." Then, as quickly and silently as they'd arrived, they were gone, taillights disappearing around the corner, leaving Rosa alone on the cold pavement with her torn photographs scattered around her like fallen leaves. A single detail would later prove to matter more than anyone realized in that moment. One of the men had worn a strange, ornate silver ring shaped like the head of a fox, a small vanity that Vito allowed only his most trusted men to wear, a mark of belonging that none of them ever imagined could be turned into evidence against him. Rosa managed, with trembling hands, to reach a payphone and call her son, and the sound that came through the receiver was unlike anything Sammy had ever heard from his mother before. Not words at first, just broken, gasping sobs. And then finally, brokenly, the sentence that would haunt him. Sammy left the stage mid-song, still in his performance suit, the band trailing off in confusion behind him, the audience murmuring as he sprinted out through the side exit into the cold night air. When he reached her apartment and found her sitting on the floor of her small kitchen, her silver hair come loose from its pins, her hand still shaking as they clutched half of a torn photograph of him as a boy, something in him broke quietly and permanently. He knelt and gathered her into his arms and said, again and again, "I'm sorry, Mama, I'm so sorry," as if the apology itself could undo what had happened. She cupped his face in her trembling hands and told him, "This isn't your fault, son. I'm just scared for you." And in that instant, Sammy felt something cold and unfamiliar settle into his chest. Not simple fear, but a kind of helpless fury, because he understood immediately, without needing to be told, exactly who was responsible, and he understood with equal certainty that there was no path available to him that didn't end in more danger. He went to the police the following morning anyway, sitting stiffly across from a tired desk sergeant who took his statement with visible reluctance, glancing more than once toward a closed office door, as if expecting someone to walk out of it. 2 days later, the sergeant called to inform him, in a flat, rehearsed voice, that without witnesses willing to identify the men involved, there was little the department could do. Sammy hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long time, understanding for the first time just how completely the machinery of that city had been built to protect men like Vito, and to leave everyone else to fend for themselves. Word reached Dean not from Sammy, who was too proud and too frightened to ask his friend put himself in danger, but from an old waiter named Franco, who had worked the casino floors for 20 years and loved Sammy the way a man loves a nephew he watched grow up. Franco found Dean in his suite late one evening, sitting at the piano, playing something aimless and unfinished, and said, his voice unsteady, "Did you hear what happened to Sammy's mother?" Dean's hand stopped over the keys instantly. "What happened?" And when Franco laid out the details, the black car, the torn photographs, the bruised blooming purple on an old woman's arm, Dean's hand closed slowly over the edge of the piano until the old wood gave a sharp, unhappy crack in the quiet room. "Who did this?" he asked, and his voice was calm in a way that unsettled Franco more than shouting would have. Franco hesitated, glancing toward the door as though the walls themselves might be listening, and finally said the name that made every conversation in that city drop half a register. Vito. Even the sound of that name in an empty room carried weight. The police avoided him not because they lacked the manpower to bring him in, but because every investigation that drew too close to Vito's operations had a habit of losing its witnesses, its evidence, and occasionally its investigators, to unexplained transfers and unexplained silences. But Dean had grown up the hard way himself, the son of poor immigrants who understood exactly what it meant to watch a mother humiliated for the crime of loving her child too visibly, and he understood, in a way that went beyond friendship, exactly what Sammy was carrying. Sammy wasn't merely a colleague to him. Over the years of shared stages and shared struggles, Sammy had become something closer to a brother, and Dean had never once, in all his life, been the kind of man who could sit comfortably while someone he loved suffered in silence. The next afternoon, Dean went to Sammy's apartment and found him sitting hunched in a corner chair, carefully taping together the torn halves of his mother's photograph with a meticulous, useless focus of a man trying to repair something far larger than a piece of paper. "Don't get involved, Dean," Sammy said without looking up, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "This is more dangerous than you understand." Dean sat beside him anyway, quiet for a moment before speaking. "Sammy, I'm not letting you carry this alone." Sammy shook his head fiercely. "He's not a man you argue with. He'll hurt you the way he hurt her or worse, and I won't be able to live with that." Dean's answer, delivered without any theatrical weight at all, simply and plainly, was a sentence Sammy would repeat to his own children decades later. "I'm not afraid of a man who beats up old women. I'm afraid of standing still while I watch the people I love suffer." Over the following days, Dean moved carefully, deliberately, never announcing his intentions to anyone but Franco, whom he trusted completely. He spent evenings in the smaller bars along the edges of Vito's territory, listening far more than he spoke, letting men loosen their tongues around a friendly, familiar face who never seemed to be asking questions at all. He learned the rhythms of Vito's world. The private party Vito threw every other week in a small, unlicensed club well away from any official eyes, a gathering where Vito surrounded himself with his most loyal men and performed, for their benefit, an ongoing theater of his own untouchable power. And Dean learned, more importantly, the single weakness buried beneath all that performed menace. Vito could survive almost any private failure, but he could not survive public humiliation in front of the men whose fear was the entire foundation of his authority. Take away their fear, and there was nothing left holding the structure up at all. Meanwhile, Rosa barely left her apartment in the days that followed, flinching at every car door slamming outside her window, sleeping in fitful stretches interrupted by nightmares she wouldn't describe to her son. Sammy visited every day, sitting with her long into the evening, racked with a guilt that Dean kept gently, persistently pushing back against. "The fault isn't yours," Dean told him more than once. "The fault belongs to a sick man who hurts the defenseless to feel powerful. Don't you dare carry his shame for him." The night Dean decided to move, he dressed with unusual care, his best black suit, his hair combed back with deliberate precision, and he stood in front of the mirror a long moment, studying his own reflection as though giving himself one last chance to change his mind. He didn't. He picked up the phone and called the manager of the club where Vito held his private gatherings, requesting, with practiced charm, a slot to perform a special number as a personal gift for Vito on the night of his next party. The manager, startled at first by the unusual request from a headliner of Dean's stature, agreed almost instantly once he understood whose name was asking. Dean's reputation opened doors all over that city, doors that men far more dangerous than club managers were reluctant to keep closed. The night of the party, the club was thick with cigarette smoke and the low, syrupy pulse of a jazz trio working through standards nobody was really listening to. Vito sat at the center of the room in his usual pose, one leg crossed over the other, a glass of whiskey held loosely in one hand, surrounded on every side by men who laughed a half second too quickly at whatever he said. The particular laughter men who have learned that their safety depends on finding their boss endlessly amusing. When the music cut abruptly and Dean stepped up onto the small stage, immaculate and unhurried, Vito's face lit with genuine, unsuspecting pleasure. "Well, look who came to pay his respects," he said to the men around him, loud enough for the whole room to hear, and they laughed on cue. Dean opened with an easy, warm smile. "Good evening, everybody. Tonight, I've got a little something special for our friend Vito." Vito beamed, gesturing grandly to his men, as if to say, "You see, even the biggest stars know who runs this town." But Dean continued, his voice unhurried, almost conversational. "Before I get to the gift, though, I want to tell you all a short story. A story about a very powerful man. So powerful, in fact, that he had to send 2 of his men to beat an elderly woman in the street because her son turned down a free show." The entire room went dead silent in the space of a single breath. Vito's smile didn't fade so much as it simply stopped existing, replaced by a stillness far colder than any anger. One of his men half rose from his seat, but Vito raised a single finger, and the man sank back down without a word. "Let him finish," Vito said quietly, and the quiet in his voice was somehow more frightening than a shout would have been. Dean went on, laying out the details he had spent weeks assembling with the calm precision of a man reading from a ledger: the date, the black sedan, the torn photograph album ground into the sidewalk, and finally, the silver ring shaped like a fox's head worn by one of the men who had gripped Rose's arm. Each detail landed harder than the last, because together they didn't just prove Vito dangerous. Every man in that room already knew he was dangerous. They proved him small, proved that beneath all the fear and reputation was a man petty enough to hurt a defenseless old woman over a canceled favor. The murmuring in the room grew, and several men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances, because even among men who had done terrible things themselves, there were lines that still meant something, and striking another man's mother sat well below all of them. "You're talking about things that have no proof behind them," Vito said, his voice tight now, stripped of its earlier ease. In answer, Dean reached into his jacket and produced a photograph. One Franco had managed to capture almost by accident from across the street, grainy but unmistakable, showing one of Vito's men with his hand locked around Rose's arm outside the market. A collective gasp moved through the room like a physical wave, and several men actually eased their chairs back from Vito's table, as to try and put visible distance between themselves and whatever was about to happen to his name. Vito shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "Enough! You came into my club to embarrass me in front of my own men." Dean's reply came with total, unhurried calm. "No, you embarrassed yourself the moment you decided to hurt an old woman instead of facing a man like me directly." The line struck harder than any physical blow could have, and the room watched transfixed as Vito's face cycled visibly from rage to something closer to naked humiliation. And then something happened that no one in that room, least of all Vito, had anticipated. A young man near the back, new to the organization, barely into his 20s, still trying to prove himself worthy of the men around him, rose slowly to his feet, his voice shaking as he spoke. "I was there, boss. I was one of the two he sent. But he told me we were just going to scare her, that's all. Nobody said anything about beating an old woman." The confession landed in the room like a dropped glass, and Vito turned on the young man with an expression of pure, undisguised murder in his eyes. But the words were already out, already witnessed, and there was nothing left to be done about them. It was in that moment that Vito felt, for the first time in years, the ground shifting beneath the throne he'd built for himself. The image he had spent a decade constructing, untouchable, feared, absolute, was cracking apart in real time in front of the very men whose loyalty depended entirely on believing that image was unbreakable. He tried, one last time, to hold the room. Nobody here is going to believe a lounge singer and a traitor over me. But Dean's response cut clean through the room's tension. People don't need to believe me. People just need to open their eyes and see exactly what kind of man needs to beat old women to feel powerful. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before it, and one by one, quietly, several men began drifting toward the exit, unwilling to remain seated at a table whose authority had just visibly collapsed. But Vito wasn't finished, and the danger of the evening wasn't over. Feeling his authority slipping through his fingers in real time, he made a final, desperate grab for control, motioning sharply to two of his largest men. "Take him outside." The mood in the club shifted instantly from tense curiosity to genuine fear, chairs scraping back as people cleared away from the center of the room. Sensing violence about to unfold in front of them, Dean didn't move an inch. He stood exactly where he was and said, loud and clear enough for every corner of the room to hear, "If anything happens to me tonight, there's a sealed letter sitting with my lawyer with every detail of this laid out, and it gets opened first thing tomorrow morning, if I don't call to stop it myself." The two men Vito had summoned froze mid-step, glancing back at their boss for instruction, because they understood immediately that this was not an empty bluff. A man like Dean, with his connections and his public profile, didn't make threats like that without meaning them. Vito stood there for a long, suspended moment, running the calculations behind his eyes. Hurting Dean in front of this many witnesses wouldn't just be an embarrassment to absorb quietly. It would bring real investigation, real headlines, possibly federal attention that his entire operation could not survive. The fear of consequence, for the first time that night, outweighed his fury. Slowly, he waved his men back to their seats and lowered himself back into his own chair with the heaviness of a man who had aged a decade in the space of 10 minutes. In the stillness that followed, Dean stepped closer and spoke to him quietly, just between the two of them, though everyone in the room could still hear every word. "I don't want a war with you, Vito. I just want you to stay away from Sammy's family and away from anyone else's family, just because you need to prove to yourself that you're powerful. If anything like this happens again, it won't just be me walking in here to talk. It'll be every reporter and every investigator in the city who knows your name and knows exactly what you did." Vito said nothing at all. He simply nodded, slowly, a small motion that looked far less like agreement than it did like surrender. The story tore through the city within days, not through any official channel, but the way the truest stories in Vegas always traveled. Passed hand to hand in whispers between dealers and waiters and lounge singers, growing new details with every telling, shrinking others, but always keeping intact a single unshakable core of it. A simple man had stood, alone and unarmed, against the most feared man in the city, and he had won, not through violence, but through the plain, unbearable weight of the truth spoken out loud, in front of people who had spent years too afraid to hear it. When Sammy heard what had happened, he rushed to Dean's suite and pulled him into a fierce embrace. "You're out of your mind. They could have killed you in there." Dean just smiled, tired but genuine. "But they didn't, and what matters is your mother gets to feel safe walking to the market again." When Rosa was told the full story later that week, she wept quietly, not from fear this time, but from a gratitude too large for words, and told Dean, her voice unsteady, "God bless you, son. You did something nobody else in this whole city would have had the courage to do." Dean took her weathered hand gently in both of his and said, "Your family, Rosa, and nobody touches our family and walks away from it clean. In the weeks and months that followed, Vito's world didn't collapse in one dramatic night. It simply began to erode, slowly and irreversibly, the way sandstone wears down underwater it can no longer resist. Word of his humiliation had reached every corner of the city's underground, and the fear that had once been his entire currency began to lose its value overnight. Men who had once trembled at the sound of his name started testing small boundaries, taking liberties they never would have dared before, because they had watched, with their own eyes, another man stand up to him and walk away unharmed. Within a year, his organization had splintered into smaller, warring factions, several of his most loyal men peeling away to align themselves with rival operations that suddenly looked more stable, more permanent, than a boss whose reputation had been publicly, irreversibly cracked. Vito himself left the city quietly sometime after, without spectacle, without a final confrontation, in a departure so unremarkable it barely registered as news at all, and that quiet, undignified fading away proved, in the end, a far crueler punishment than any single violent night ever could have been. The story of that evening lived on in Vegas long after the neon on that particular club had gone dark for good, retold not merely as a tale of one man's bravery, but as something closer to a parable about the true nature of loyalty, a reminder that the loudest, most fearsome power in any room is often the most fragile, built on nothing sturdier than the fear of the people standing beneath it, and that a single voice willing to speak an inconvenient truth out loud, in front of the very people, conditioned to swallow it, can do more damage to that kind of power than any weapon ever could. Sammy carried the story with him for the rest of his life, telling it to his own children years later not as a boast, but as a lesson that real friendship survives its hardest tests, and that standing beside the people you love, especially when it costs you something, is worth infinitely more than the safety of standing apart from them. And whenever anyone asked Dean in later years what had really happened that night, he always answered the same way, with the same modest, almost embarrassed smile, waving off any suggestion of heroism. "I didn't do anything special," he'd say. "I just couldn't stand the idea of watching my friends suffer while I did nothing about it." It was a small sentence, plainly spoken, but it stayed lodged in the hearts of everyone who ever heard it, carried within its few simple words the entire, uncomplicated meaning of what it truly means to be somebody's friend, the kind of friendship that never counts the cost of showing up and never once looks away from the people it loves, no matter how dark the room or how powerful a man standing in the doorway.